Welcome to Thrive Deeper, the show based on the Thrive Bible reading guides. This is an ongoing conversation about God's Word with Thrive author, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Thrive Deeper.
Yes, your fortnightly Bible study.
That's
right
it.
Here.
And we're continuing in the book of Matthew and a little bit of Mark. And listeners, if you haven't been following along, really encourage you, even if you just skip back to the beginning of the series on Matthew, it'd be well worth the journey to where we're at this point. But we're picking up today, Matt, from Matthew chapter 16, and it's starting to get to sort of a fairly pointy end of the Matthew's gospel in terms of what's happening with Jesus, and as he in fact returns from sort of Gentile land back in towards Jerusalem, and his focus now is really directly towards the cross, and we'll see that. But there's a lot of stuff we're going to, listeners, cover from chapter 16 to just into chapter 22 today, and there's a lot in here. We won't probably be able to go into detail on everything, but some really important statements and parables here from Jesus, Matt.
Yeah, but it's good to get it in that bigger snapshot.
Yeah.
It's the movement of the way that these stories are put together by the gospel writers is really important, because they're making really important points about Jesus, and of course ultimately about the good news for us. Now, chapter 16, Stu, is actually a very pivotal chapter. It's in this chapter that Peter confesses Christ.
Yes.
And then Jesus starts talking explicitly about his impending suffering and death. And it's actually here that they start heading towards Jerusalem as well. Yeah. This is kind of that final journey. But at the beginning of the chapter, it's interesting because that famous moment when Peter, says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Just before that, that's kind of contrasts with the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the area that are keeping a close eye on Jesus. Now, they've kept a close eye on Jesus. They've seen all of these different miracles that he's done. They've witnessed all of this. And yet they still come to him. I don't know if you noticed this, that in the context it's absurd.
Yeah.
Like, we want a sign. It's like, are you joking? I mean, he's done so many things. And it says there actually to test him, they ask for a sign from heaven. Actually, this kind of echoes, and I think this is what Matthew sees and wants us to see. This is echoing the temptations of Satan in Matthew chapter 4 in the desert. If you are the Son of God, perform this miracle, change the stones into bread. And, Jesus says, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Oh, well, actually, he says that about jumping off, the temple. They're really echoing, they're speaking in that voice in a sense. And basically his answer to that is, look, I've done all of these things and you're just not seeing because you kind of don't want to see.
Yes.
That they are amongst those who don't have eyes to see and ears to hear. And so in a sense, what sight they have has been taken away from their hardness of heart is going to be compounded. We're going to see that actually as we move through this story. There's increased polarization right up to the end. It's almost, in some ways, it's a miniature of world history as we see it in Revelation. As you move towards the end, things get more polarized. Well, as we move to the end here of the gospel, things are going to be really polarized to the point where we get to, is it Jesus or Barabbas? And they choose Barabbas. Like, how clear can you get? This is already starting here.
Jesus then kind of warns the disciples to be mindful of the.
That's right.
He uses the term "beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees."
Which is a warning against that way of thinking, being caught up in minor details. I mean, they're all confused about bread, and he's trying to teach them, bigger things, but they've got to lift their heads and see the big picture.
Interesting, though, that we heard him talk previously about a little bit of yeast in the dough.
Yeah.
We take that, and Jesus, in that context there, as being good yeast in the dough, but he's kind of saying here, just a little bit of bad yeast can have exactly the same impact.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So they head up to, they're heading into Caesarea Philippi, which is it's interesting here that he heads there. And you think, why there? Because it's actually a really important pagan cultic center. Right. I mean, you can go there today and you can still see the altars and the grottos and everything where all of this pagan idolatry took place. And so, it's an interesting kind of place for Jesus to go and where then he's going to draw out this declaration of him, as the Christ. And the sense here is that the context, declaring that in the face of this pagan idolatry, in a sense depicts Christ as the universal Lord over all peoples he's declaring that in the face of pagan idolatry, in the midst of that he is not just the Messiah of Israel, but he is the Messiah, he's the King for all peoples and all nations. So when they get there, it's there that because he elicits this, he asks them, okay, let's now get this really clear. Who do people say that I am? And, they say, well, some say this and others say that. And some say that you're a kind of
prophet of some kind.
Yeah, some kind of prophet in the spirit of Elijah or Jeremiah, and others say this and others say that. And he asks, but who do you say I am? And this is when Peter steps forward and says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So the idea of sonship there is the Psalm 2 sonship. Today, the Lord has said, you are my son. To be the Son of God was another way of talking about this kind of divine kingship, divinely bestowed kingship. And so that is, that's by this stage, very well-known kind of messianic idea. And so, Jesus commends him for this and then gives him this promise, there's a word play on Peter, Petra, which is
rock.
Which is rock. His name actually means pebble, but he says, but I tell you that you are Peter. You're a pebble, but I'm going to make you a rock, and I'm going to build, my church on this rock. As the first confessing disciple, this is he in a sense is the beginning of this movement that's going to be called the church. And
he's the first steward, really,
that's right.
of the church.
Yeah, that's right. And then there's this sense that even death itself is not going to stand in the way of the advance of this kingdom. There's a sense in which this kingdom is going to snatch people from death to eternal life in that sense. So hence his statement about the gates of hell not prevailing against it. That's a good point, Stu, because in a lot of translations it says the gates of hell, but it doesn't actually use the word that's normally used for hell in Greek, Gehenna. It's actually the gates of Hades there, which is
typically considered
the realm
death.
of the death.
Yep.
It's just, it's another way of saying death. And then, he says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Now, you is plural there. He's talking.
You and the church.
That's right. As the church, he's talking to his disciples as the beginning of the church. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So there's this sense of promise over them that they are the authorized mediators of the new covenant, in a sense. That's, so those phrases are a fairly well understood way of referring to mediation, covenant mediation. This is establishing a new priesthood, beginning with them, essentially. I think it's important that we don't individualize this too much.
This is not about Peter.
Yeah, so I'm going to visualize what I want to happen in this situation, and then it's going to be, what I'm going to bind and it's going to be bound. No, it's actually it's given to the church as a whole, and this is a corporate way of thinking, because together we are the body of Christ.
Yes.
And it doesn't, that in no way detracts from the importance of our individual role before God, but it does, I think, encounter in an important way an individualistic approach to this that's about me and what I want or what I think should happen and so forth. So,
no, it's good.
Because it's a corporate purpose that we're stepping into. So it's interesting that in the light of that confession, you are the Christ, Jesus then goes on to explain that he must go to Jerusalem.
He says, don't tell anybody. It's like, hang on.
The next bit explains why, actually, because if they go out and tell people are going to understand that in completely the wrong way. Right. And in fact, it becomes evident that even Peter understands that in the wrong way. So look,
Jesus is trying to make sure the message doesn't get too corrupted here.
Yes, he's the Messiah,
yet.
That's right. But he hasn't quite got it, because and look, it's understandable, Stu, because again, the Messiah is this victorious figure that's going to come and
which is what they expect.
Judge the earth.
Get rid of the Romans.
This political,
reestablish the Jews as the rulers. Yep.
That's right. So when he says that he's going to go to Jerusalem and that he's going to be killed, it says on the third day raised. I think they kind of miss that bit. But Peter takes him aside and, rebukes him. It's like he says to Peter, get behind me, Satan, you are a hindrance to me. So, it's the same, what was happening. And this is the yeast of the Pharisees, right? He's just said to them, beware of this yeast of the Pharisees, right? Yeah. Because they've just wanted the sign that, and now, Peter's he's falling into a way of thinking that is thinking in terms of the things of humans, not the things of God. Yeah. And so, he says, get behind me, Satan, you're a hindrance to me.
Which was a huge statement, given he just said, I'm going to build my church on you, then get behind me, Satan. I mean, man.
It's a very profound moment. I mean, and certainly Peter does actually become a rock.
Totally.
Very important beginning of the church. Absolutely. But at this stage, he's
still trying to shift perspective away from things of the world to things of the kingdom.
Yeah, that's right. And so because at this point he's still got in mind the things of man. And I think this is always in terms of its importance for even today, that we can still even today want the Messiah of political control. Yes. And we have in mind the things of this world and not the things of Christ, because it's through sacrifice and humility that we move forwards, that the kingdom of God moves forwards, not by this exercise of political power.
And we pick that up now as he goes on. Jesus goes on to say about taking up our cross. It's like, here's the exact picture of that.
That's right. And the language there is, because you could always speak about taking up the sword or taking up your weapons.
Right.
That's the sort of language that's used if you're going to go to war, right? You take up your weapons and you go into fight.
Yep.
It's not that. Here says, if you're going to follow me, it's not take up your sword. It's not take up the weapons, political, military weapons. And it's not that we withdraw from politics. Don't hear me saying that. But he's saying, let's make sure we pick up the right weapons, and it's sacrifice and humility, it's self-denial. And so he says, if you want to follow me, actually, you're going to take up your cross, because this is actually how we win. And when you look actually at the first 300 years of the history of the church, they suffered intense sporadically, but quite intensely. They suffered continual waves of persecution throughout that period. And yet the Christian movement spread right throughout the empire, more than Judaism ever really managed in that time. Way more influence. So
just before you move on though, because I, for many years, particularly earlier on in my Christian walk, I really took that take up as crosses. Oh, that's the little inconveniences and stuff. I just have to accept that's the cross I've got to carry. I think it's important to remember, when you picked up a cross, that meant there was only one destination. You carried a cross to your death. And so it's this willingness to die to ourselves completely. It's not just, a bit of harassment over here or mocking over there. That's my cross. No, that's not a cross. That's just mocking and harassment. To pick up your cross means I'm heading in the direction, I'm walking the direction of death to myself, so that I might serve God's kingdom purpose.
It's about the ultimate cost. It's a life for life thing, really, discipleship. But I think it's important to, state as well that the cost is diminished by what is gained on the other side. Jesus has already said, whoever wants to hold on to his life is going to lose it. But if you give your life for me, you'll...
Which is he's about to say again at the end of that passage.
That's right.
In fact.
Yeah. So he says an interesting thing, actually, at the end of that. He says, truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. You think, well, what is this?
Well, I kind of read that because it then goes straight into chapter 17, and it's sort of 6 days later, a very specific time zone. And then suddenly they're up on this mountain and they're seeing Jesus. In a sense, the veil is pulled back within 6 days of him making
and some of them, not all of them.
Some of them are seeing Jesus revealed for who Jesus really is.
So I think that's, I think Matthew is interpreting that by placing this straight afterwards. And it's interesting too, after 6 days, it's, I think that with its connection with Genesis chapter 1 and potentially it really was 6 days, but so it's Peter, James and John that in a sense see, and the word coming there isn't the word parousia, which is, coming. It's not talking about the return of the return of Christ. It's the
taking his seat.
That's right. It's manifest, taking as it were.
Place,
coming, erchomai is the Greek word. So it's almost like seeing him manifest in his kingdom, which is exactly what happens. They have this, incredible vision of Jesus clearly demonstrating that he's more than a human teacher.
They're seeing Jesus in a whole elevated way.
Yeah, that's right.
Compared to how they had seen him up until that point. So up until that point, they'd seen him largely as the man, the Son of Man. Now they were seeing him as, in a sense, as the veil was opened.
That's right.
The Son of God.
It has, striking similarity. Story certainly evokes the story of Moses on the mountain and
coming down.
Moses' face is shining, but there's a little bit more going on here. He's transformed in a sense that he displays the direct glory of God in a sense. And then there's the connection with Moses and Elijah. There's that connection with them as really the two main prophets of the Old Testament. Two prophets that, by the way, had these encounters with God on the mountain, on the same mountain as well. And so, this is...
most likely Herman.
Yeah, probably. I mean, Mount Tabor is also another, has been suggested as the traditional site. We actually don't know what the mount was. Probably doesn't matter that much. But certainly the idea of having this encounter on a mountain is important. So they have this, this very direct kind of experience, and this comes after the confession. The confession comes first.
Yes,
and this is, I think, is part of Jesus showing them that he's more than just a earthly figure here.
Yes.
This is something transcendent. So I think that's an important. Of
course, Peter wants to build some tents and just stay there because it's a great place to be, and I can totally understand that. I'd probably want to do the same thing, but that isn't what happens. And when Peter then looks up next, there's just Jesus there. Elijah and Moses have gone.
Yeah, that's right. They ask the question then about, the scriptures talk about
Elijah coming,
and Jesus says, he's come. That's John the Baptist, pretty much. So we have an interesting story, and Mark actually gives us more detail on the next story. It's this interesting encounter with this demonized boy that the disciple, because meanwhile Jesus comes down and the disciples have been working at exorcising this demon from this boy, and they can't seem to really do this. And it's interesting, Jesus kind of he rebukes this demon, and they say, why couldn't we do this? And he makes this statement, this kind can come out only by prayer. I mean, that's an interesting statement in the light of our sister podcast and Thrive Perspectives. And it's good, I think, at this point to refer to that because we do discuss these elements of demonization, this aspect of the spiritual world, and we explore some of these things in greater depth. But it's an interesting story.
In Matthew, of course, he refers to the mustard seed faith aspect of it. Mark, as you say, takes that approach. In Matthew, he also speaks to, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you'll be able to tell a mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. And he sort of said to the disciples in Matthew, it's because of a lack of faith.
Yeah, that's right. Well. So it's in Mark that he says this kind comes out only by prayer.
That's right.
And it's interesting because in a sense, Matthew, by putting that there, sort of interprets, probably Mark came first. And Matthew, in a sense, is sort of in interpreting that, taking, and certainly Jesus probably always said more than what we've actually got here. But the aspect of faith, is important for Matthew. It's actually consistent right through. Matthew actually has quite an emphasis on the importance of faith. That's quite a big theme throughout his gospel. So at this point, it's interesting, the movement here, because there's a confession of Christ, them struggling with the sort of Christ he's going to be. So let's just see all these stories together. I think this is important at this point. So Peter confesses the Christ. Jesus then predicts his death. So this is how I'm going to win. Yes. Peter is struggling with that, right? Jesus says, no, he rebukes him, says, you have in mind the things of men, not things of God. In a sense, what follows is Jesus saying, let me show you how the things of God work, right? So then there's the transfiguration. This is the sort of Messiah that I am, right?
Yeah.
This is something that transcends
everything else.
A sort of physical kind of battle, and which is confirmed when he goes down and he drives out the demon from this boy, right? So this is the kind of war that we're fighting. And then you get this next announcement of this. And there's 3 points in what follows where there's Matthew 16, and then there's here in Matthew 17, and there's going to be one more coming up as well, where Jesus says to them again and again and again, he just keeps reminding them, we're going to Jerusalem and I'm going to suffer and die and be raised again.
Yeah.
So it says, as they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him and he will be raised on the 3rd day. And they were greatly distressed, understandably.
Yeah. Mine actually used the word betrayed into the hands of men.
Yeah.
I don't think that's so important, but it is the first time that we've read anywhere where it's actually, he is actually going to be betrayed or given or delivered, as you said, into the hands of men. Then we get this interesting one around the temple tax.
I think this fits well in the context.
Yes.
Because, the question is, what sort of battle is he fighting? What is he going to take issue with? Now, the temple tax was in some ways a controversial thing. It was supposed to be, according to the scriptures, a voluntary contribution to the temple.
To help pay the temple staff.
But it
and
was
maintain
made
the
into a compulsory,
a tax. As opposed
that's
to a
right.
gift. Yeah.
And so they just sort of got that wrong. And Jesus does say something here to point out that he just doesn't think this is right. Okay, so he says, they ask him about this, and he says, this is not really right. Taxes are paid by, subjects.
Yes.
But we're sons.
We're family.
That's right. And sonship is about sharing together, and so it's a different. He's correcting the idea.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that he then goes on to say, but look, let's not cause offense.
Yeah.
And
that's
this is
great.
really interesting.
Put your rights aside, your entitlement aside.
Yeah.
Because, that's true. But put that aside because let's not offend people over here.
That's right. This is keeping the main thing the main thing.
Totally.
Because he could have taken issue with that and fought a battle on that hill.
Yeah.
But he's not going to do that. Yet at the same time, he's willing to go, as we'll see in chapter 21, he's willing to go into the temple and turn up tables.
Yes.
That's going to offend a few. He's really choosing his moments in his battles here. And I think this is such a good, because I think we think that if we sort of offend people, we can claim, yes, they've been offended. And of course, yes, the gospel is offensive. But we see in both Jesus and we see this example in Paul actually as well in Acts 21.
Yes.
Where he goes out of his way not to offend Jewish sensibilities. So, there's an inevitable offense to the message, but Jesus and then Paul, following his example, they go out of their way to avoid unnecessary.
So the goal is not to win the fight or to be right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
the goal is to win people for the kingdom.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that's a really interesting moment there. What follows here then, and this is kind of...
We're in chapter 18 now.
They're sort of turning to, it's at the beginning of 19 where it explicitly says they went away from Galilee at the beginning of chapter 19 and entered
But they're on their
Judea.
way.
But they're kind of on their way, and there's this sort of moment where there's this discussion around community and how things are going to work in the community of disciples. This is a subject that is very important to Matthew as one of the gospel writers, because he's writing this at a time where they're establishing the infant church and the principles that are going to sort of maintain the church. And so he recollects these teachings of Jesus, anticipating a new kind of community that he's setting up here. And it begins with this example of children. Who's the greatest? They're going to ask him, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Particularly, probably, I think, somewhat in the light of Peter having been told that that you are the rock, and on this rock I'll build my church. So, maybe there's some debate over
hierarchy.
Oh, so are you making him the boss?
Yes.
There's probably been, some discussion around. I wouldn't be surprised. At this point, he calls a child and he puts him in the midst, and he says, unless you turn and become like little children, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And the point is that he's illustrating humility, because children were
the lowest, really.
In a sense, were seen as of no real account.
As human beings, there wasn't anyone lower, really.
That's right. He's flipping the hierarchy upside down. Okay, so you need to be willing to become as the least. And in fact, Christians for pretty much the next 3 centuries are going to be of the lowest.
Yes.
They're going to be of the lowest. And he says you've got to be prepared to be the bottom of the pack. And so, high status is not the thing. If you're going to enter the kingdom, joining the worldly game of seeking high status is just going to hijack what we're doing here. Yeah. And it's not that there are plenty of Christians who, through history, in fact, we see this in the book of Acts, who have been of high status, and God has even used their high status for his own purposes. There's been plenty of that. But, he's saying, just remember that you've got to be prepared to humble yourself like a little child. This is how things are going to work.
And I think it's important there, because then it flows into the next segment where he talks about the parable of the lost sheep. We've got to be careful that we don't judge people as lesser Christians than us, in a sense, using the child analogy again. We've got to our job is actually to protect and to nurture those that are young in the faith, that are like little children, not to take advantage of that.
So as we've said before, Matthew's gospel is a lot about discipleship, being a disciple and making a disciple. It's interesting, the description that's used here of disciples are these little ones.
Yes.
Right? He's just said you've got to become like children. in a sense, he says, but look, woe to those who take advantage of them because they are little ones. And he said, in fact, he says that it would be better for you if you cause one of these little ones to stumble through temptations and the testings, and because what's going to come is a persecution that is actually going to cause some people to stumble.
Yes.
And Jesus is, in a sense, pronouncing ahead of time, woe to those who cause one of these little ones to stumble. It would be better of you if you tied a millstone around your neck and were drowned in the sea. Yeah. So there's a real sense of his zeal for his humble children here, which then, is an imperative for, like, there's a pastoral imperative here as well in this, like, look after my little ones. And the idea of, shepherding the sheep is a real important theme throughout the prophets when they're addressing the leaders of Israel in the Old Testament. They're rebuked for not caring for these little ones, the sheep,
Yes.
And so, that's where the parable of the lost sheep, that he leaves the 99 and he goes and he seeks out the one lost one. So there's a pastoral imperative, a sort of priority there in a sense. And look, this is what Jesus was doing essentially, wasn't he? I mean, he was criticized for reaching out to the sinners and the tax collectors, and he explains, well, I've come for the lost. His priority is the lost sheep, and so he's applying that same principle to a sort of pastoral, in a church context. Yeah. And in that context, in fact, is this teaching about, well, if your brother sins against you, he's been talking about, the brother who sins. You really you've got to go out of your way. If someone strays, don't cut them off. You actually, it's going out of your way actually to draw in. We're not ostracizing sinners.
No.
We're reaching sinners. This is what Jesus has modeled this, right? And in this context, he says, okay, so if someone sins against you, you communicate. Don't cut them off. Do the opposite. Go communicate with them.
This is how you made me feel.
That's right. Yeah. If they won't listen, seek a bit of mediation. If they still won't listen, ask the church, and this is interesting because the first time he's actually referred to the church explicitly.
Yes.
I'm sorry, he says, on this rock I will build my church. But it's the first time after that, explicitly talking about how things are going to be in the church. And then it's like, okay, once you've done everything you can, then you just got to let him go.
And he uses the term, let him be like a Gentile and a tax collector to you. I think that was probably just a common phrase used by Jews at the time for anyone that was a bit kind of...
Well, then you can treat them as an outsider.
Yeah, an outsider. It wasn't specifically that, because Jesus has been for the Gentiles. He's been out. It's not like he's contradicting the fact that we don't care and love for Gentiles.
That's right,
He's just using a phrase probably that was common at the time to say they're outsiders. He goes on to say at the end of that, just to sum up that bit before we move into the parable of the unforgiving servant, Matt, he makes that statement again. I truly tell you, if two of you on earth agree about any matter that you pray for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered together in my name, I am there among them. So again, a reference to the church, the authority that we're given about binding on earth, what also will be bound in heaven.
Yeah, it's interesting in the commentaries. This is seen as a way of referring to prayer. There's a sense of the imperative here is you can treat them as an outsider, but there's a sense of the next step is praying for them in a sense. You know what I mean?
Okay. In the context of that same ongoing story.
That's right. And this is where, again, I say if two of you agree on anything, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. So this is this is in the context of prayer. And so then for where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am among them. There's a sort of judicial sense because, it's the two or three witnesses.
Yes.
And that has been mentioned in that context.
Yes.
But that actually is also in the context of this statement about binding and loosing and asking something from God. And there's a sense of, and this is the importance of the statement about binding and loosing, whatever you plural, right? It's you plural. When if you agree together as a church, I'm going to honor that. And so I think that's the nature of the promise here, from what I've gathered from the commentaries on that verse. This leads, the context, of course, leads Peter to ask an interesting question about forgiveness. Okay, so let's say, so I've been wronged, right?
And again.
And I go to that person, right? Yeah. And let's say they do repent, but let's say they do it again, and then they do it again, and then they do it again. How many times should I forgive? He says, should I up to 7 times? And And Jesus says, no, it's 77 times.
Yes.
And it's an interesting reference there, actually, to some words of Lamech in Genesis chapter 4, where Lamech says, Cain is avenged 7 times because God had promised that anyone who touches Cain, remember he put a mark on Cain and he said, if anyone touches him, then he'll
face my judgment.
Face my judgment, 7 times over. It's a way of, it's the number of completion.
Yes.
Now, the interesting thing there is it's God saying, vengeance is mine. Like, I will avenge him 7 times over.
Yeah.
In Genesis chapter 4, when you get to Lamech, what you're meant to see when Lamech says, hey, Cain is avenged 7 times, but whoever even just wounds me, right, I ever killed a man for wounding me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, Lamech 77 times,
yes.
right? So this is like disproportionate retribution, but also disproportionate retribution exercised by a human being. This is Lamech taking God's prerogative to judge.
Yes.
And it's interesting that Jesus evokes that, because that's everything that's wrong with the world, is this cycle of retribution.
Yeah.
It's the sin of Lamech.
What you do to me, I do back to you.
That's right.
Twice over.
Yeah, that's right. It's the sin of Lamech, essentially, which is taking the prerogative to judge and the prerogative to dish out retribution. And Jesus, again, by alluding to that, by talking about the 77, and he is alluding to that, is saying something that completely reverses that trajectory, right? Yeah. So now you're going to forgive 77 times. And it's not, by the way, that when you get to 78 times, you can stop. You can stop.
It's like saying hundreds of times. And
it's unlimited.
When I get to 999, we use that term to mean unlimited.
That's right. And it's unlimited because the grace that we receive from God is unlimited. And this is what he goes on to point out in the next parable, where he talks about this servant who is forgiven. Now, the amount that the servant is forgiven is an enormous amount. Actually, in the original, it's 10,000 talents. I mean, a talent was probably a weight, about maybe 30 kilograms, perhaps, of metal. I mean, the exact amount varies, but it probably was conventionally around 6,000 denarii was a standard, that was their dollar in a sense. And 1 denarii, by the way, was about a day's wages, was an acceptable day wage. So 1 denarii, right? So 1 talent is 6,000 denarii.
Yeah.
He was forgiven 10,000 talents. Yeah. Right. I mean, it's
no one could imagine.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's basically an unimaginable. It's almost,
it's a bit like the 70 times 7. It's just imagine the biggest number you can and go 70 times.
That's right. So the servant is forgiven this, and then he goes off, and one of the other servants owes him, what does he say?
Fraction of it.
Like 100 denarii, right? I mean, which is nothing. It's a few cents in comparison. And he seizes him and he turns him over to justice, and I mean, the servants are incensed by this, and so the point. I mean, it's a brilliant parable to sort of illustrate why it is actually we must forgive. I mean, in the light of what God has done, it actually completely reframes what's even just. Man.
Yes,
like it actually is unjust for me.
Yeah,
I mean, we might say, but that doesn't seem right for me to forgive someone that wronged me. No. Absolutely, it is in the light of, because it's relative. In the light of what God has done, actually, it would be completely wrong. Yeah. And that's what the parable is meant to depict. The other servants are absolutely shocked, right? It's so obviously wrong that he would not forgive these 100 denarii in the light of the fact that he's been forgiven 10,000 talents, right?
So essentially, there's nothing that another human being can do to us that we can't forgive in the context of how much God has forgiven us. I mean,
that's right.
That's the reality of that. An incredibly significant amount that God has given. I mean, it's his entire life to save us, and yet we're going to quibble about what someone said about us. We need to get past that and forgive it. And again, even in the Lord's Prayer, when Jesus teaches us how to pray, God, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us.
Yeah. And look, throughout Jesus' teachings, he's always pointing to the bigger principles. Yeah. One of the problems with the rabbinic teaching around this time, just got lost in details. It was preoccupied with law, which is what comes up in the next conversation, because they ask him, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? And this is a debate that's going on in between rabbinic schools at the time. Because, at this time you could divorce a wife for anything, like any cause pretty much, based on a law of Moses where he allows for divorce.
Yeah.
I mean, because there are a lot of people saying, well, it's in the law, you're allowed to divorce, and they were using that as a loophole. So what Jesus does, he says, no, you've lost sight of the principle. This again is them keeping the main thing the main thing.
Yes.
The principle is that the two become one, and what God has joined together, let no man separate.
Yes.
And of course, the exception is if there's been marital unfaithfulness, then that's already broken.
Yes.
The bond, but otherwise, he's pointing out this principle.
And he's also saying, it's because you had already gone so far, hardened your hearts and broken. I'm actually just trying to put a Band-Aid on something that the ideal is this.
Yeah.
So don't shoot for the lowest common denominator.
Yeah, that's right.
Our goal shouldn't be how can we get
God's
around.
best for us.
Yeah. It should be how do I stick to God's best for us.
That's right. Yeah. And I think it's important that we don't treat this again like
another
in this legalistic sort of sense, because Jesus is pointing to the principle. No, let's aim high, right?
Yes.
Let's aim for this. Like the law of Moses was given because when you get things wrong and things, okay, there's an allowance for this, but let's not take advantage of what's an allowance for when things become impossible. Let's aim for the, for the ideal. It's interesting, I think, in response to that, the disciples, and I think they're being I think this is sort of in jest, this next statement.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it's better not to marry. I mean, I think it's interesting, the commentaries treat this as a bit of a jest, like kind of, well, we would probably better off not marrying then, like if you can't.
Yeah. And which was unusual in the time, of course.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's why I think, a lot of commentators take that as being in jest, because of course, not being married is unthinkable for a Jewish man. Yeah. It's just not it was never even seen as an option, So it's interesting that Jesus then goes on to say, well, actually, there may be cases where, particularly, because again, he's addressing this new community and what might be required of people in the church. And of course, famously, Paul, the Apostle Paul, ends up not marrying that he gives up this, his opportunity to be married and have a family. And so he becomes one of these people that is, well, a eunuch in inverted commas by gift or choice. You know what I mean? And so that's what Jesus is basically saying. Look, this actually, I know up to this point, if it's unthinkable for you not to be married, but actually in the time to come, this is actually could be an important choice for the sake of the mission. I think that's an important section there.
Totally. I think he's also perhaps saying, understand the commitment you're making when you do, and if you can't make that commitment, make it.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
That as well, I think is an important one.
But he is anticipating the fact, because I mean, at one point, Paul, in 1 Corinthians, Paul says, look, it's actually, I would advise, given the troubled times that we live in, stay single. Yeah. It's actually better. And he's talking specifically of those times. Yeah.
Anyway, moving on to the rich young ruler.
Yeah. So a lot of the discussion, again, context important. I'm going to keep mentioning context. A lot of this has been about, status and who's the greatest and all of those sorts of things. And, Matthew relates his account where little kids are brought to Jesus, right? Yes. And the disciples go, come, just get rid of these. It's too important for these.
Yeah.
And Jesus says, no, actually. I mean, he's on his way to Jerusalem, but he's got time for these, for children, which I think for a rabbi would have been very unusual at this point to sort of fraternize with little kids, but Jesus is willing to do this. So on the one hand, he receives little kids, but then a man who they would have seen as the ideal candidate, right?
Yeah.
Turns up. Oh, this is who we need. He's law-abiding. He's godly. He's a rich young man.
Which suggests the blessing of God.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, he's referred to by the other Gospels as a rich young ruler. Okay, so and we're not exactly sure in what sense, but he has some status. He's got quite high status in society as well. And I mean, all of this for the disciples in their context indicates, this guy. Here's a blessed man. This is like, here's a guy like Abraham, And so,
he asks the wrong question.
Yeah, teacher, what good deed must I do to enter life? And Jesus says, look, cool. Let's talk about goodness, in other words.
Yeah.
If you're talking about being good enough.
It's all relative.
That's right. And
No one's good enough.
okay, if you're talking about being good enough, have you kept the law? Yes, I've done all of these things. And then Jesus basically exposes there's something in your life that actually you won't be willing to let go of.
Thinking back to,
and that's
deny yourself. Exactly.
Exactly. Context is everything.
Yeah.
So
it's a matter
if you
of
would
heart.
be perfect, sell your possessions, give them to the poor, you'll have treasure in heaven, and then come and follow me. I mean, he's inviting him.
Yeah.
Sure, you can come and follow me, but
this is what it's going to cost
because of, and it is actually going to, I mean, in these, at this stage, it is going to cost all of that. In a sense. So, and this guy's he's not willing to do that. So he goes away.
But I don't think
dejected.
Jesus is saying we shouldn't be financially well off or have things. I think it's if those things become so important to us that we're not willing to put them away so that we can do what God's commanded us to do or Jesus is leading us to do. If we make a decision that says, I can't make that choice to follow you, Jesus, there because that would mean me giving up this, that's where the problem is.
That's where the problem is.
Yeah.
What follows actually, the discussion that follows actually, in fact, right into chapter 20 is essentially a commentary on this because the disciples are understandably completely shocked about this. It's like, well, hey, what? If this guy can't
qualify,
enter the kingdom of, like who on earth can? Like this to them was the most qualified person.
And so
for
then
the
Jesus makes
God.
it even harder.
Yeah. I mean, they say in verse 25 of chapter 19, who then can be saved? And it's interesting, Jesus' statement, because he doesn't say you have to be poor to be saved. It's not that actually isn't what he's saying. He says with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. Because he's just said, look, it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God than for a camel to enter through the eye of a needle. This is a standard sort of saying from the day. It's not real. I know some people have tried to soften this by suggesting that the eye of the needle was a gate in Jerusalem, and it may have been, but Jesus isn't talking about, they've tried to
overinterpret.
He's using this saying to demonstrate impossibility, right? Yeah. That for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God, on the one hand, he's saying it's not possible, but then he says, but with God, all things are possible.
That's right. Yeah.
And then,
so we can't do this on our own, essentially, is what he's saying.
And then they say,
well, we've
left everything.
Yeah.
And what will we have? And he says, look, you'll have your reward. But he says at the end here, look, that's great. You've left and this is where there's a tension here, because they're saying, oh, well, we've left everything.
Yeah. So
and essentially what he says now is, but hang on, just careful now. The giving up your wealth, this is not how you earn status either in the kingdom of God. That was never qualifying that young man for this.
Yes.
Because he says in verse 30, but many who are first will be last. Like, so just watch out, right? Because you think, hey, we've left it, we've sacrificed everything. Well, hang on, just be careful. Because if you think you're the most qualified, you might end up being the least qualified.
And the next parable speaks into that.
And the next directly speaks to that, which is the parable of the workers in the vineyard, right? Yes. Where a landowner promises a certain wage for a day, right? And the workers agree to that. Yep. That's fair. Okay, fair wages.
Yeah.
Some people turn up halfway through the day and they work half the day. And some other guys rock up right at the end of the day, do like an hour's work, and they all get the same wage, right? And Jesus is saying this, what I'm going to give you is by grace, right? You don't earn it by giving away your wealth.
Yeah.
You don't think that you don't be achievement oriented here. You're not earning your place by giving up things or doing commendable, heroic, spiritual deeds. Because actually those who turn up, those who you think are actually the least deserving, the first will be last and the last will be first.
Yeah. I think there's a great lesson in this too about not comparing ourselves to others. What God's promised to give us, he's given us. And the fact that some other person is doing amazing things over here, as long as we're being obedient to what God's asked us to do, whether that's for the whole day, a half day or an hour, that's the main thing. The reward will be what God has given us.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now they're still stuck on the status thing. So first of all, Jesus announces, this is the third announcement in chapter 20 of verse 17,
as they
that he tells them again, we're going to Jerusalem, I'm going to be delivered over, a bit more detail, going to be mocked, flogged, crucified, raised on the third day. Each time he mentions the resurrection, they don't seem to
question it at all. No.
Well, yeah, I mean, and they don't seem to have remembered that actually when he is
raised.
Because they're quite surprised actually when...
And of course, the first one was the Jonah, was the sign of Jonah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, in the light of that, the mother of the sons of Zebedee,
James and John,
and John, asks, can my son sit at your, right hand and your left hand, and when you come into your kingdom, I mean, Jesus says, you don't really. I mean, I think because again, they're still thinking a kind of earthly kingdom,
authority, ruling.
Yeah, that's
power,
right. So
in charge.
So come on, see, he's just talked about dying.
Yes.
And so, okay, all right. So if you're going to die, who's going to take your place when you come into your kingdom? What's the order? And so I love it. Mum comes.
Yes.
Come on, my boys.
They've been good and dutiful, and
that's right.
Yeah, surely they should
listen,
be.
You don't know what you don't know what you're talking about. But he says you actually will. You actually are going to drink my cup. And of course, James is thrown off the temple and stoned. So he becomes a martyr. John is going to be imprisoned and so forth. So they are actually going to share in his persecutions.
Yeah.
So I mean, and again, you have this teaching of Jesus where he says, "Listen, guys, this is the things of men again. This is the problem with them thinking in terms of the things of human beings and the way of the world." He says, "You're not like the Gentiles who lord it over each other. That's not what."
It's not a race to the top.
That's not what authority means in the kingdom.
Yeah.
Whoever wants to be great needs to become your servant, right? And so all through this journey, this is the consistent theme through this journey right up to the triumphal entry.
Mm.
And that's important that he's stating that, because the way that Jesus enters into Jerusalem is going to underscore this point. And he's saying, listen, being great, if you want to be great in the kingdom of heaven, be prepared to become the least and be humble and lowly.
And that's where that verse that we hear quoted so much, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for me.
Yeah, that's right. And so he comes through Jericho, he heals these blind men. They recognize that he's the Son of God, so they're not spiritually blind in a sense.
No.
That's right. And then, he sets up this, organizes to have this donkey, not even just a donkey, actually the foal of a donkey. It's never been ridden before, as we find out in the other Gospels. And he's going to enter Jerusalem on this donkey. And this is a very, very important symbolic act, because the way that this unfolds as he comes into Jerusalem, and lots of people are coming for the Passover, right? So lots of people from Galilee, words got around, lots of excitement, the Messiah, all of this has gotten out, right? And he's going to actually perform a symbolic act that is going to connect with Nehemiah chapter 9, which talks about the Messiah is going to come to you, not riding on a war horse.
Yeah.
He's not going to be a man of war, but he's going to be a man of peace.
And also Isaiah,
and lowly and gentle.
Both of them predict this as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Prophesies.
Did I say Zechariah chapter 9? No, not Nehemiah. Correction. Zechariah chapter 9, there's the
prophecy.
This prophecy about the Messiah coming and riding on a donkey, on the foal.
See, your king is coming to you, gentle and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey.
Yeah.
Jesus
is, and victory marches into cities, very well known, all the pageantry and the laying down the cloaks and waving palm branches. That's what you do for a victory parade, right? When you're welcoming a conquering king.
Yeah.
And the conquering king always comes in riding on the war horse, but this king comes riding in on a donkey. And so that's the importance of that symbolic act. But he comes in riding the donkey. He's gentle and lowly, but then he comes to the temple and he does the next prophetic act.
Just before you go there, though, just to point out, in case you may have already mentioned it, Matt, and I may have missed it, but at this time this is very important timing, because this is when everyone's coming to Jerusalem for the Passover.
Yeah.
So there's lots of people coming from all the cities and towns and villages around. So there's a lot of people there, and therefore the temple is pretty busy, because it's the annual pilgrimage essentially to the temple.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So therefore there's lots of money changes in our. The money changes are there because
they performed an important service.
There needs to, because actually you can't, if you're coming from a long way away, you're not going to bring your sacrifices with you. It's easier just to bring money, buy an unblemished sacrifice there. Most people were poor, and so would have bought the doves or the pigeons, right? So that was the offering for the poor, which is why it's specifically mentioned here. And you would need money changes because they needed a standard currency, which was actually from a Phoenician currency, actually, that probably would have been used here. So, that's a little bit problematic, kind of in a way. He turns up these tables, and part of the problem here, and in doing this, he quotes this passage in Jeremiah chapter 8 about the, making this place a den of robbers. And there's going to be ongoing reference to Jeremiah chapter 8. Now, Jeremiah chapter 8 is important because it's in the context of leading up to the destruction of the temple, right?
Yeah.
So in a sense, Jesus is performing this role because, of course, in 70 AD, within the generation of this moment, the temple's going to be destroyed again, right? So, Jesus is saying, look, you've made, it's the same, you're doing the same thing. This is meant to be a house of prayer.
Yeah.
The other Gospels add for all nations, but you've made it a den of robbers. Now, part of the problem here is all of these money changes. This would have been in the outer courts.
Yes.
Now, if you're a Gentile,
that's the only place
that's
you can
the only
pray.
That's the only place that you can pray. But the outer courts are crowded with money changes.
Yeah.
It's going to inhibit what it's actually meant to be about in order to serve this tokenistic religious function, right? So in a sense, what Jesus is countering here and prophetically speaking against is exactly what Isaiah and Jeremiah spoke against, which is this token religiosity, right? Which misses the point, right? I mean, a lot of people cite this as like, oh yeah, we need to go out into society and all the terrible things that are done out there, and we need to be able to turn tables and go out with the whip. It's like, no. This is actually in our day and age, this is like Jesus actually coming into the church and rebuking us for sort of tokenistic
coming
worship.
and doing our things on Sundays and being happy and then going and living our week like nothing.
Exactly. That's the equivalent, right? So, that's
and important. He's not just
act.
Turning over the tables of those selling. It says he threw out all those buying and selling, where it wasn't just the sellers who were the bad guys. It was the people who thought that they could just, that buying their offering was ticking a box, and that was, as you said, their token religiosity.
Yeah, that's right. So this is, part of the problem here as well is that this is challenging the authority of the religious leaders of the time. You're on, this is, I think now, Jesus has been reticent to do anything too overt, because his time hadn't yet come, but now his time has come, right? So he's going to
continue to polarize.
That's right. He's going to polarize now. And so in a sense, he is claiming this prophetic authority. The religious leaders are like, who does this guy think he is? So in a moment, he's going to challenge their authority. But actually, before Matthew talks about the challenge, because they're going to come to him and say, listen, by what authority are you doing these things? Before
there's the barren fig tree story.
We have this interesting fig tree story. Now, the interesting thing about this, again, this is another prophetic act. So we've had these sequence of prophetic acts here. First is the riding in a donkey, right? It's Zechariah chapter 9 fulfilled. Then we have the turning over the tables, right? That's Jeremiah. Then the cursing of the fig tree actually continues to evoke Jeremiah chapter 8, because in Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 13, it says, I will take away their harvest, declares the Lord. There will be no grapes on the vine. There will be no figs on the tree, and their leaves will wither. So the fig tree, in a sense, symbolizes Jerusalem.
Right.
And his cursing the fig tree is this, it's this sense of, well, you're not yielding fruit, so now I'm going to curse you so that you are unable. It's hardening the hearts of those who are already hard.
Yeah.
Even what you have will be
less.
taken away. Yeah, that's right. So, that's an important prophetic act.
And interesting, a commentary that I read talks about the fact that this was in some way also because the fig tree had leaves but no fruit. It's like the empty worship, which doesn't produce fruit. It's like coming along and ticking boxes, doing church, for want of a better word, but not getting out there and being Christ in the community.
That's right. And so when he is then asked about his authority, like, who the heck do you think you are? He said, well, let me ask you a question. I love this.
Yeah, it's great.
He answers a question by asking a question. It's like, I think this is so important because he's the one, he's being judged. But in a sense, he is the judge.
Yes.
Right? Hang on. Let me ask you a question. It's interesting because he asked them about the baptism of John. John, the importance of that, because they've asked by what authority, and it was the same issue that they had with John, because John was baptizing people, right, for the forgiveness of sins, right? And they were concerned with John. Hang on, what authority do you have to do this? Because only through the temple can this happen, right? And so, in a sense,
but they did recognize him as a prophet, though, didn't they?
Yes, that's right, and which is where they get stuck on this question, because Jesus, in this context of authority, by whose authority? Jesus is essentially saying, well, I'm in John's stream here, right? This God has begun to do something, and I'm in this sort of prophetic John the Baptist kind of thing, and John the Baptist heralded me.
Yeah, you can't pick and choose what you're going to believe from John.
So let me
John
ask you
said
this.
who I
So the
was,
question
yeah.
is, was John's baptism from God or from
Human.
men? And then they're stuck, right?
Yeah.
Because they're surrounded by people who recognize that John was a prophet. So it's sort of he really shuts
So they
them
go,
up
we
with that
don't
one.
know.
Yeah, that's right.
And so
And
he
then
says, well, I'm not going to answer you then.
I'm not going to answer you. And then he
So then he
gives
tells
this parable, what's better? Someone who says that they're going to do something and then doesn't do it,
Yeah.
or someone that says they're not going to do it but then actually eventually does it. And basically what he's saying is that these scribes and Pharisees, they're like the people that are all about the law and we're going to obey God, but actually you're not. You're not really willing to obey. You're just kind of saying you're giving me lip service here. And he's explaining why, but yet all of these sinners, supposed sinners, they're the ones that have said no to God at some point. They're actually the ones that are getting it here, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So
You guys who think, and again, this is where we see Jesus showing his frustration and anger largely to the people who thought they were righteous. In fact, always really through the Gospels, his anger is vented on those who think they're the righteous ones. Yeah. And in fact are just completely missing the point.
That's right. And it's important he's making these points to the religious leaders that are there.
Yeah.
And I mean, the next parable that he tells us even puts the knife in even further, because he tells this parable of the tenants, which is a familiar prophetic picture of Israel as the vineyard and so forth. And, he tells this, God is plants a vineyard and then gives it over to these religious leaders and then, sends his servants, the prophets. They kill the prophets, and then finally sends his son to his own vineyard, right?
Yep.
Sends his own son to his own vineyard, and they say,
"No, this is the heir. Let's get rid of him.
Let's kill him.
Then we can make it ours."
And so he's actually talking about them, and he's actually predicting what they're going to do.
And they know
him.
he is too.
Yeah, I mean, he quotes the scriptures, the stone, Psalm 118, which is important because that Hosanna in the highest, that was being declared. Psalm 18 was an important psalm for this particular occasion.
Yes.
And so the exclamations of the people during that triumphal entry are also out of Psalm 118. So it's a topical psalm for this time. And he says, because this has actually been prophesied, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Now, in context of Psalm 118, it is talking about Israel, the stone of no repair. It's actually, I've made this unimportant nation into the keystone. But remember, Jesus here, in a sense, fulfills or becomes the true Israel in this context. Yeah. And so it's also a word play here, because stone and son, Ben and Eben is stone, and Ben is son. Right. So the stone, the son. Right. You've rejected the son, and the son, the Ben is the Eben. Is the stone that the builders rejected. So that's what he's doing there.
There you go. Of course, they wanted to arrest him because they knew he was talking about them. Couldn't do that because there were so many people that were supporting him there. We already heard about him entering Jerusalem and people cheering. We'll just jump into 22 because there's the third parable that he kind of speaks to here to kind of, again, point the point home for the Pharisees and the priests.
Yeah, so the idea of the eschatological wedding feast, the sort of Isaiah chapter 65, the new heavens and the new earth, it was depicted as this great sort of wedding feast, and so that's a familiar picture, and Jesus is saying here, basically through this parable, it's like, the king is inviting the people that were originally invited to the feast, and they don't come, right? Yeah. So Jesus is saying, I am inviting you to the wedding feast, but you're actually refusing to come. Yeah. And so we're going out to the highways and the byways, so to speak. We're going out to, initially the sinners and the people that you would reject, but ultimately, actually, this is a prediction of the fact that this is going to go out to the Gentiles, and they are going to receive an invitation that you would not receive.
Mm. And he talks about the burning down of their city. You kind of wonder whether he's pointing forward to the destruction of the temple,
absolutely
which had become
absolutely,
which become the main thing instead of God. And he's going, we're going out.
Yeah,
beyond
absolutely,
the temple now.
absolutely. And it was, I think, just an explanation here, because it was customary for these weddings that people who didn't have clothes would be provided with clothing for these wedding feasts. Because at one point, in the parable, the king sees someone that doesn't have the clothes on, comes to the feast but doesn't have the clothes on, and he's cast out. Because we are clothed and made ready. This is the point here. God issues the invitation. He makes the way. He provides the clothing. He does everything. All we need to do is accept the invitation to come that comes to us through Jesus Christ. It's a free gift.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Thrive Deeper. Our home on the internet is thrivetoday.tv. You can contact us, ask questions, see all our resources and much more at our website thrivetoday.tv. We really appreciate the questions and thoughts about what you're reading as we go through the Bible with Thrive. Until next time, our prayer is that these shows will inspire you to go deeper and thrive.